1,000 days. That's how long it's now been since the Russian tanks started rolling, paratroopers landed on the outskirts of Kyiv, and Vladimir Putin launched his so-called special military operation. Before the invasion, some on Russian state TV had been telling the Russian public that if an operation was launched, that they were in for a short and sharp war. What they got was a drawn-out conventional slugging match, quickly approaching the duration of some of the 20th century's most destructive conflicts. Over the course of those 1,000 days, both sides have experienced both victorious highs and painful lows. For Ukraine, there have been moments of elation, like the liberation of Kherson, but also the painful battles for places like Bakhmut and Avdiivka. And as the war carries on now towards 2025, both sides are showing plenty of signs of immense exhaustion, but few or any of a willingness to give up the fight. And so today I want to ask how the war, these armies, these nations have changed over the course of the war, not just since 2022, but also since 2 weeks ago. Because as both sides jostle to maximise their bargaining positions ahead of late January 2025, we've suddenly seen a flurry of the old taboos dropping away. From Western-built missiles now being used against North Korean officers on Russian territory, to Russia electing to test a new model of ballistic missile by firing it against a Ukrainian city. And so today I will be looking at some of those recent escalations, while also asking the question, what might we see next? To do that, I'm going to look at the phase of this war, but also some of the most recent escalatory moves and countermoves. Then I'm going to zoom out to try and provide a bit of a bird's eye view of how the forces fighting in Ukraine have changed over the course of the last 1,000 days, how the nature of the fighting on the battlefield has shifted, and then finally, some key pinch points in the ability of those armies to continue fighting, and what they may or may not be willing to give up to end it. That should help frame things up for a quick discussion about what we might expect to see over the next couple of months, and potentially set the stage for some more detailed dives in the future. So given this is a 1,000-day update, I thought it might be worth putting recent developments in a bit of perspective, flagging that this is very much a war we've seen play out in phases, with the initiative and the balance on the battlefield shifting back and forth. Russia obviously began with the initiative in February 2022 and had some significant wins, particularly in the south. But particularly in the north of Ukraine, with thrust towards places like Kyiv, the Russian military appears to have massively overplayed its hand. The Russian forces weren't just stopped, they were significantly degraded. And as Ukraine began to call up its reserves and leverage its pre-existing stocks of ammunition and equipment, the initiative shifted. That gave us at least 2 strategic-scale Ukrainian offensives at a time where the Ukrainians certainly didn't outgun the Russians, but they did likely have more available manpower at the front, and the advantage at this point of being deeply motivated and probably more than a little pissed off. In just a short span of time, just in the Kharkiv region, the Ukrainians would take back more territory from the Russian Federation than Russia would conquer from Ukraine over the entirety of 2023 and 2024 to date. But the rapid reverses for Russia both asked a lot of those Ukrainian troops involved and also prompted Moscow to take the situation more seriously. This is where we saw Russia announce that it would be mobilizing hundreds of thousands of additional troops, as well as directing more existing units towards Ukraine. That saw the initiative largely flow back to the Russians, while the Ukrainians prepared for future operations. Russia used that period to launch some offensive operations, including the Donbass, most famously taking Bakhmut. That would obviously carry some consequences for Russia of its own with the later Wagner mutiny, but it did place significant demands on Ukrainian resources, even as they were trying to build them up in preparation for a major offensive in the south of the country. In what was undeniably a defensive victory for the Russians, that Ukrainian operation wouldn't reach even its minimum objective of Tokmak. With the shortage of engineering equipment, amid the minefields, defensive positions, and the work of Russian attack helicopters, a lot of Ukrainian offensive potential was expended breaking into the Surovikin line, but not through it. From that point on, while there will always be exceptions and variation, especially at a local level, Ukraine stood mostly on the defensive, and that's the way the fighting has arguably mostly played out over the course of 2024. The year basically started with Ukraine experiencing a massive famine of desperately needed munitions and military supplies, owing to aid from the United States being held up for months. That arguably helped set the conditions for high losses amongst Ukraine's infantry units, and Russia seizing a number of key objectives, most significantly Avdiivka, a defensive anchor very close to the city of Donetsk itself that had otherwise managed to hold on for years. There would be at least one moment of dramatic reversal, with the Ukrainian forces bursting across the Russian border into the Kursk region and seizing hundreds of square kilometres of Russian territory, but for the most part, the closing months of 2024 so far have seen comparatively faster Russian advances, especially in the Donbass, compared to 2023 or early 2024. That said, a degree of perspective is always required, with the chart on screen showing the dramatic extent to which Russia has really picked up the pace. If there is one image that tells the story of Russia's war in Ukraine in 2023 and 2024, it may be that chart, with the change in the percentage of Ukrainian territory controlled by the Russians being barely perceptible to the naked eye, despite the immense expenditure of men and materiel, and the fact this chart doesn't factor in Ukrainian control of any Russian territory. Now, however, the war in Ukraine is arguably in a new phase, one that will likely last, to pick a date at random, until January 20th, 2025. And with Trump's stated policy goal being to get a rapid peace deal in Ukraine, all sides have an incentive to try and shape conditions and improve their bargaining position as much as possible before he enters office. And that brings us to the comparative madness of the last few weeks, where we've seen the White House embrace a very different escalation appetite to boost up Ukraine's capabilities, while Russia has very much attempted to dial up the pressure. For a White House that has arguably erred on the side of extreme caution much of the time when it comes to escalation risk, the last couple of weeks have been a significant deviation in form, with a flurry of announcements intended to boost Ukraine's military and financial position, while also flying pretty brazenly through a couple of Russian red lines. A week ago, I said it had been reported that the US would be providing authorization for some long-range strikes into recognised Russian territory using Western systems like ATACMS and Storm Shadow. Now we may have evidence of those announcements becoming actions. Russia claims, for example, that 6 ATACMS missiles were recently fired against an ammunition depot in the Bryansk region, with 5 of those obviously being destroyed and another damaged by the incredible Russian air defense system, although Moscow does suggest that some fragments of the damaged missile may have fallen within the technical territory of a military facility in the area, causing a fire that has subsequently been extinguished. And for reference, here is an image reportedly showing that minor fire. That said, the main evidence we have so far for ATACMS being used in Bryansk comes from the Russians themselves, so take that as you will. However, following the US announcement, it also appears that both London and Paris have loosened the shackles a bit on the Scalp and Storm Shadow cruise missiles that they've been supplying to Ukraine, and we now have drone footage that appears to show one of those missiles striking a Russian command post in Russia. And when I say one Storm Shadow, I actually mean as many as 12. The apparent target appears to have been an underground command facility, with the missile salvo basically excavating their way to the target. As to what could possibly be valuable enough to Ukraine to justify the use of 12 of its valuable Western air-launched cruise missiles, it may be linked to some of the reporting we've seen by the Wall Street Journal, citing Western intelligence officials, that a senior North Korean general may have been among those at least wounded in a recent Ukrainian strike. For the moment, that remains unconfirmed, and the final status of the general in question unknown. But if true, while it probably wouldn't represent the most measured use of valuable munitions, I imagine that Kyiv probably feels that dropping a brace of Storm Shadows on a North Korean general is probably the kind of message that's unlikely to be mistranslated in Pyongyang. In any case, the evidence of Western missiles now being used against Russian targets in Russia is now fairly overwhelming. This particular red line came very close to lasting 1,000 days of war, but as with so many others, it's now been crossed, and British and French regards are now being sent across the Russian border. Another new one on the list is that the United States will now be providing Ukraine with anti-personnel landmines. This is a break from previous Allied policy, which has generally only allowed things like anti-tank mines. In this case, the previous barriers to providing this kind of equipment were probably less based on fears of Russian escalation and more policy drivers. Due to the risk they can pose to civilians, a lot of NATO states have divested anti-personnel landmines entirely, along with things like cluster munitions. And it's been a fairly long time since we've seen the US make any significant employment of the weapons that are likely being sent now. We've now been told that the mines being sent are going to be of, quote, non-persistent types, meaning that if no one steps on them in a given period of time, they are meant to self-destruct. That obviously reduces the likely risk to civilians and helps us narrow in a little bit more on what the US might be sending. One possibility, for example, would be 155mm atom rounds for Ukraine's various howitzers. This is a remote mining system that would enable Ukraine to deploy small anti-personnel minefields over relatively long distances by firing them out of artillery. There are other non-persistent anti-personnel mines in US inventory, but again, they tend to favour being deployed at a distance. And from Ukraine's perspective, all of these might potentially be useful because they're relatively cheap, available in quantity, and might provide some assistance to Ukrainian units with manning issues, for example, trying to hold back Russian infantry assaults. From a military perspective, though, the impacts probably come down to how quickly they're supplied and what quantity they're supplied in. Significant numbers of landmines might have helped the Ukrainians in previous defensive efforts, around places like Avdiivka or Bakhmut, for example, but it remains to be seen what kind of role they might now play going forward, especially against things like protracted Russian infantry assault tactics. where small numbers of infantry constantly attempt to move forward until they reach a critical mass in a forward position and are able to launch an assault. In that kind of scenario, for example, you imagine there might be some value in being able to drop a minefield behind that forward unit, cutting it off from potential reinforcements. Finally, we've seen Biden decide to give the Ukrainian government a bit of a financial boost by forgiving the better part of $5 billion in outstanding US loans. Under the terms of the April 2024 aid package, the US loaned Ukraine about $9.4 billion US, with a provision that the president could forgive up to half of that. Something that Joe Biden, as part of his broader effort to surge as much aid as possible to Ukraine between now and the 20th of January, has now apparently decided to do. Based on what we've seen of the Ukrainian 2025 budget so far, $4.7 billion is a bit over what Ukraine needs to keep the country going for a month. Add that to other major sources of financial assistance and the $50 billion in loans secured against frozen Russian assets, and Ukraine's financial position to carry on the war through 2025 is looking increasingly secure. This move obviously wouldn't compensate for the absence of any future US aid packages, but it would somewhat increase the amount of runway that Ukraine has to work with. And as the US over the last couple of weeks has very publicly been dialing up the support for Ukraine, we've also seen the Russians responding. At the top of the list has been one of Russia's favourite tools since even before February 2022, the explicit or implied nuclear threat. Because even though in the past, surprise, surprise, Russia hasn't decided to respond to the West giving Ukraine access to Javelin missiles or artillery systems or main battle tanks or longer-range missiles or F-16 fighter jets or advanced anti-aircraft missile systems, or the movement of Ukrainian troops into claimed Russian territory, like Kherson, or the use of Western weapon systems against claimed Russian territory like Crimea, it is obviously highly credible that Russia might choose to embrace national suicide and start a global thermonuclear war because a couple of cruise missiles hit a North Korean general in Kursk. That observation aside, one of the Russian signalling mechanisms this time was to have Putin actually sign off on that revised Russian nuclear doctrine that we discussed a couple of episodes ago. As we discussed, it doesn't change an enormous amount, but does overall somewhat lower the threshold for potential nuclear use. For their part, the public responses, at least from some NATO capitals, have been relatively clear. The French foreign minister responded to the news by saying, quote, "We are not intimidated," end quote, which on the spectrum of diplomatic language is about one step removed from telling Moscow to get bent. This is arguably part of the risk when you normalise the use of nuclear threats as part of your strategic repertoire. Every time you don't follow through with a mushroom cloud when a red line you chose to draw is crossed, there's a danger that your future threats might be taken just that little bit less seriously. While we obviously didn't see a nuclear response from Russia to these recent US policy changes, we have seen a response. Putin recently announced to the world that Russia had test-fired its new Oreshnik ballistic missile against a target in Ukraine. Some media sources have called this the first use of an intercontinental ballistic missile in an actual war, at least as long as you don't count North Korea's long-running missile campaign against neighbouring sea life. Whether or not that threshold has actually been crossed, though, is probably a matter of definition. The US is so far indicating that what the Russians call the Oreshnik is probably based on or related to the RS-26 Rubezh. And there are US documents out there referring to RS-26 as an ICBM, but also those referring to it as a shorter-ranged, intermediate-range ballistic missile. Either way, this is a particularly novel use of a very expensive system, and there's a couple of observations we can make. The first is the video we have of the attack itself does appear to be consistent with a ballistic missile mounting multiple independent re-entry vehicles. As you can see on the right there, the angle of the attack is basically vertical, with some very fast-moving, very hot objects punching straight into the ground, albeit with a notable absence of any nuclear explosions. It's also notable that in the grand scheme of things, the signature when the projectiles hit the ground isn't particularly massive. That's perhaps understandable because while these re-entry vehicles would be going very fast and have a fair amount of kinetic energy behind them, compared to something like a large conventional cruise missile, you'd expect them to be able to carry much less high explosive, if indeed they were carrying any at all. It's entirely possible that Russia may actually have chosen to launch this attack using inert re-entry vehicles, relying on nothing other than their speed to cause damage to target. Indeed, the Russian military has such limited potential use for a thing like this that it's not even clear they invested in developing a high-explosive payload for it. Instead, essentially what we may have been seeing is a test weapon fired from a test range using inert test payloads. And if you're wondering why they may have done that, one potential explanation is that countries don't generally tend to fire IRBMs that might be worth tens of millions of dollars intended to carry nuclear warheads against conventional targets, because it's very expensive, not particularly effective, and tends to put everyone on edge that you might actually be launching a nuclear attack. It's worth noting that while Putin announced the first use of this Oreshnik missile with considerable fanfare, from a military technical perspective, it's not really clear if there's anything actually new here. nor any performance characteristic that would actually be useful in Ukraine. Sure, this is a new MIRV-equipped ballistic missile, but countries have had intercontinental ballistic missiles that can carry nukes since the 1950s. MIRVs took a little longer to work out, sure, but the US still had a MIRVed Minuteman design before the women of Switzerland gained the right to vote in national elections. It's quite literally a 1960s technology, and as for the missile being hypersonic, as Putin pointed out, that's kind of just a result of how physics works when you fire a missile on this kind of trajectory. From Ukraine's perspective, this is a Russian missile which is relatively difficult to intercept and which could hypothetically carry a nuclear warhead. But Russia has hundreds of other missiles matching that description that it has already been firing at Ukraine, most of which are going to be considerably cheaper, usable in larger numbers, and actually be designed for the task at hand, meaning they can carry actual conventional warheads. Iskander, for example, has proven to be very accurate, difficult to intercept, considerably cheaper, and carries hundreds of kilograms of high explosive to boot. It's fully capable of carrying nuclear warheads, and you can launch it from a very mobile launch system that you can position just about anywhere, rather than taking a while to set it up on your missile test range. The long story short here is, from a technical perspective, Russia didn't really demonstrate anything new. It signalled it had a new way to nuke people, but it already had so many ways to nuke people that it's not entirely clear what, if anything, this actually changes. Meaning that ultimately, this looks to me more like a signalling and propaganda move than a militarily significant one. There are also a few other quirks and complications around this particular Russian missile launch. For example, it's been reported but not confirmed that before the attack took place, there may have been a small drone attack against the launch site. That may suggest that Ukraine knew something like this was coming, and indeed knew it was coming far enough in advance to actually attempt this kind of drone attack. There was also a strange incident involving a spokesperson for the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs who took a phone call during a live stream, but apparently didn't move the mobile phone far enough away from the microphone, allowing the audience to overhear a short conversation, which you can go and have a listen to right now if you're interested. In that call, she's told not to comment at all on the missile strike now being reported in Western media. Now, whether or not that was a practiced act or just another absurdity in the long list of absurdities that this war has given rise to is very difficult to tell. But there are a few interesting elements where things are just a bit clearer. For one, based on both the video and what the Russians have publicly said, we can be pretty confident about the target. This was the Pivdenmash plant, formerly known as Yuzmash. This was a major facility which had once been critical to Soviet missile manufacturing, but which pivoted after the Cold War to focus on the civilian space sector. Although the Russians allege the plant may have been involved in Ukraine's plans to develop and produce a domestic ballistic missile. I'd argue one of the most interesting things about this plant being targeted, though, isn't the fact it was targeted so much. We saw that happen for the first time as far back as 2022. Nor is it the inherent irony involved in the Russians apparently firing a ballistic missile at a factory that used to produce ballistic missiles. Instead, for me, the strangest part of all this is that the plant is still there at all. Pivdenmash isn't exactly a secret or buried underground facility. It's a Soviet-era industrial location with thousands of employees that the Russians are well aware of because they used to buy products from it. And if the Russians were convinced that this massive and obvious site was being used to produce goods for military purposes, how should we interpret the fact that it hadn't previously been destroyed and was available as a target for this demonstrative IRBM launch? The broader observation here is that while Russia's strategic bombing campaign appears to have done significant damage to Ukraine's power grid and critical civilian infrastructure, it may have done a much less complete job in striking Ukraine's defence industry or preventing the country ramping up the production of everything from mortar bombs and artillery shells to armoured vehicles. The final observation I want to make about this attack is a small one, but potentially a very important one. And that is that when it comes to events like this, where the risk of nuclear miscalculation or escalation might be high, it does appear the US and Russia are still talking to each other. Based on what we've seen so far, we can be pretty confident that it was announced in the media that Ukraine would be getting permission to strike targets in Russia using Western missiles before we saw the first targets get struck. The announcement was made via the media, rather than Ukraine firing off a bunch of ATACMS and Storm Shadows in a massive surprise attack, with little messages attached to them saying, hey, by the way, the US has adjusted their policy. That may have had a greater impact from a military perspective, but the US appears to have adopted the safer, more communicative option. In turn, we've also heard that Russia used its nuclear de-escalation communication channels with the United States to give them at least some advance warning before this particular missile attack was launched. And if you haven't even gotten to the point of blocking each other yet, or leaving the other guy on red, you're probably still a couple of steps short of nuclear war. The summary here is that it certainly seems like now, as the clock is ticking down towards January 20th, the White House is suddenly much more willing to test and walk over Russian red lines than it has been for much of the last 1,000 days. Permissions have been flowing relatively quickly, and the Ukrainians have shown absolutely no hesitation in taking full advantage of them. For their part, the Russians appear to have taken a number of very public, highly visible steps that might be intended to re-establish that escalation fear. Putin's warned that there will be future attacks on Ukraine using the Attrition missile, something which would probably also qualify as an attack on the remaining sanity of Russia's central bankers, and there do appear to be a range of efforts to drive up anxiety levels in the West. So far, at least based on the public responses of several Western governments, it doesn't appear to be working. But the real indicator will probably be what additional announcements we now see from Washington DC and various European capitals in the coming weeks. Moving on though, while that particular missile strike captured a lot of international attention, what I want to do now is zoom out a bit and give a very broad overview of how we've seen the fighting in Ukraine change, and then, by extension, how we've seen it change the Russian and Ukrainian armies that are fighting it. We've seen, for example, the Ukrainian military have to basically speedrun a transition towards more and more NATO-type equipment as their stockpiles of available Soviet-style kit run down. But arguably some of the biggest changes have continued to be in that combination of push and pull factors that have continued to change what unmanned warfare looks like in Ukraine, while also making the jobs of the infantry on both sides even more miserable than they already were. Especially when you're talking about the Ukrainian army, one resource that is always in short supply is trained infantry to hold defensive positions. That's a fairly common observation by Ukrainian leaders and commentators alike, and that arguably provides a strong incentive to find technical solutions to the problem. There really is a premium in Ukraine in trying to find a weapon to effectively serve as a kind of force multiplier and allow a smaller force to defend a larger area and inflict greater losses on the enemy. And that is just one of the factors we've seen driving the enormous changes in the Ukrainian drone war. You might recall that back in mid-2023, when Russia released a report suggesting that Ukraine was consuming about 10,000 UAS per month, there were a couple of articles questioning whether or not that number might be overstated, while my suggestion was that by the time the report was published, the number was already pretty close to being outdated. Now, in late 2024, 10,000 UAS a month is rookie numbers. Ukraine's claimed they produced about 1.5 million drones over the course of 2024 to date, with capacity in 2025 for as many as 4 million. That wouldn't be 10,000 drones a month, it would be 11,000 per day. In terms of sheer availability, we've seen FPVs move from a category akin to anti-tank guided missiles, for example, to one where a commander might be more willing to expend them than they would be artillery shells. This is also a battlefield where the ratio between drones and humans may have shifted by at least an order of magnitude. Some responses we've seen to the drone threat have been decidedly low-tech, like units breaking out the shotgun, or this bloke on screen here deciding that if an AK isn't a solution to your counter-UAS problem, you're just not using enough AK. But as a general rule, the most effective responses tend to have been a bit more high-tech. To defend themselves against that ever-expanding threat, we've seen a massive proliferation in electronic warfare systems. And I don't just mean major EW systems in dedicated electronic warfare units. I mean, we are at the point now where tanks may carry jammers, MRAPs may carry jammers, supply trucks moving to and from the front may carry jammers, individual trench positions might have local jammers, and even individual troops might carry jammers. The rise in drone countermeasures then is pushing for the emergence of drones that don't care about those countermeasures. We've seen more and more videos coming out of strikes using drones equipped with fibre optic cables. Because while it is a low-tech solution, good luck jamming a cable. Another example of that has been the rapid proliferation of interceptor drones. Because apparently in this particular rock, paper, scissors contest, drone beats everything, including other drones. This mostly started with adapted FPVs, but we're now seeing new dedicated designs emerge, including higher performance fixed-wing types. And in many cases, their intended targets have been the fixed-wing reconnaissance drones, like the Russian Orlans, that the Russians have relied on to carry out reconnaissance work far behind Ukrainian lines. That has of course led to both sides trying to figure out ways to protect their drones from other drones, including equipping them with rear-facing cameras so operators can see when the drone is about to be under attack and attempt evasive maneuvers, increased performance, basic armouring so they might be able to survive the fragmentation from a small warhead, or even, at least anecdotally in some cases, drones being equipped with drone jammers. I would strongly suggest that we should expect to see this adaptation arm wrestle continue in the coming months. But if there is one development track to watch going to 2025, I'd single out autonomy. Because we are seeing the emergence of more and more UAS and loitering munitions on the Ukrainian battlefield that have built-in autonomy functions that enable them to overcome electronic warfare not by protecting their communications, but by being able to function without them. It was recently announced, for example, that Germany will be sending Ukraine about 4,000 loitering munitions with built-in autonomy. And given the massive ramp-up rates we've seen in Russian and Ukrainian drone production whenever anyone comes up with a workable concept, there is every chance we see more of this technology in 2025, not less, and the battlefield becomes an even more dangerous place for infantry and vehicles, even under electronic warfare protection. After 1,000 days of fighting, it's also worth understanding the effect that comes from different parts of these armies having very different experiences and very different casualty rates. On both sides, as is almost a historical truism at this point, the poor and bloody infantry have had a very bloody war. Casualty rates in infantry units and among infantry officers and NCOs have consistently been very high. And in previous episodes, we've covered some of the signs and symptoms of that strain. Units that were consistently undermanned, shortages of officers capable of coordinating larger units, and a constant inflow of new recruits on both sides who have, generally speaking, had less combat experience, been older and less fit as time's gone on. For some troops, however, the experience has been very different. Generally speaking, if you're a drone operator on either side, or an artilleryman working with a long-range NATO artillery piece, yes, your unit is probably eventually going to take casualties, but at nowhere near the rates of the guys having to hold the trenches. What that's meant is that while infantry units have often struggled to maintain a certain level of experience and combat effectiveness, specialists like drone operators and artillery crews have often had the opportunity to just become more expert over time, rack up months or years of experience in continuous combat operations, to the point where they can become more and more dangerous and also more effective in training new personnel assigned to their units. The skill ceiling we have seen some drone operators achieve in Ukraine is nothing short of chilling. Some units have become so effective that we've seen higher commands swap them to different points along the front line to deal with areas of high risk. Similarly, there are videos of experienced artillery crews out there, when they can get access to good barrels and ammunition, who basically seem to be able to turn their pieces into over-the-horizon sniper rifles, even when using unguided ammunition. And as this experience disparity has grown, it may have helped make the nature of the fighting somewhat self-reinforcing. The drones and artillery dominate, causing them to take fewer casualties over time and accumulate more experience, which leads to them dominating even harder and taking fewer casualties over time, which leads to them accumulating more experience and dominating even harder. Neither side in Ukraine is capable of operating without the infantry, but their core job certainly isn't getting easier over time. So if that's a very broad picture of just some of the ways in which the Ukrainian battlefield has changed, I now want to look at two questions in sequence for both militaries, starting with the Russians. What are some of the ways the force has changed in response to its experience of war? And if the war continues, what types of resource limitations might give them the greatest concern? The caveat up front, of course, is that this section is intended to be a very broad overview that's been pieced together from various bits of data, reports, and anecdotes. But with the information we have, and from my defence economic-centric viewpoint, here are some observations we might make. In the earlier stages of the Russian invasion, manpower availability was probably a lot more of an issue than equipment or ammunition. That makes sense. The best and most accessible stocks were obviously still in place, and since, at least early on, the assumption appears to have been that this would be a pretty quick war, no one seems to have shied away from using those stocks. On the flip side, the Russian invasion force appeared to be very short of infantry, and often organised in structures that weren't well suited for dealing with situations where they suffered casualties among what little infantry they did have. Part of the problem may have been organisational, but no doubt one of the major drivers was the A-tier big brain manoeuvre of taking a military that relies on conscripts for a not insignificant part of its infantry strength, and then deciding to invade another country without the conscripts. That situation probably led to Russia losing more experienced troops and a lot more equipment than it probably needed to during the early stages of the war. But eventually, through a variety of mechanisms, we saw the Russians start to address that problem. There was the partial mobilisation in 2022, extensive employment of the Donbass proxies, reliance on PMCs like Wagner, the partial emptying of the Russian prison system, and more recently, a recruitment strategy largely based on paying ever higher enlistment bonuses and salaries to attract new recruits, and thus win the bidding war for limited labour resources, often against the Russian defence industrial base. And thus what we've seen over time is that the Russian manpower situation has dramatically improved, but their equipment, ammunition and broader economic position is arguably nowhere near as comfortable as it was back in January 2022. The experiences of war appear to have pushed the Russian ground forces in the direction of a number of organisational and tactical adaptations. Organisationally, at least above the battalion level, Russia observes that this is a much more Soviet-looking army than the one that originally invaded. Quote, Russian forces have reverted above the battalion level to the traditional Soviet order of battle, of regiments, divisions, and combined arms armies. Then, to go along with that more Soviet-style high-level organisation, Russia makes the following observations about lower-level formations. Quote, battalions are organised in line and storm battalions and tend to operate in company groups which fight in small dispersed detachments. This reflects not only adaptation to battlefield conditions, but also the shortage of trained officers able to coordinate larger formations. with a significant proportion of Russian junior officers currently being promoted from the ranks and receiving condensed officer training, sometimes as short as 2 months long. In a sense, then, you could argue that both the style of fighting and organisation have been simplified, because while, thanks to Ukrainian efforts, officers capable of coordinating more complex operations may be in short supply, small, repeated attacks by a limited force against a defined position is the kind of tactical operation that even your average helldiver can understand. And to go along with that organisation, we've also seen significant adaptation. Russian artillery tactics have changed. Drones have become more integrated to their way of fighting. We've seen improvements in iteration in Russia's reconnaissance fire complex, the use of tactical ballistic missiles, the integration of things like loitering munitions as counter-battery assets, the rise of glide bombing as a new source of fires. There have, of course, been various tactical adaptations. The Russian manuals in 2022, for example, probably didn't provide for the extensive use of golf carts as part of their infantry assault tactics. And we've also seen a number of increasingly creative efforts to continue to maintain that flow of new infantry. In 2024, for example, we've seen anecdotes of Russian commanders scouring through their units to find non-infantry elements and pulling people out of those segments to keep up with the demand for infantry assaults. The search has long extended well beyond the Russian ground forces, with everything from the strategic missile forces to the Russian Navy called upon to provide more infantry strength. Back in September, for example, it was reported that the Russians had formed a new infantry battalion out of the crew of the country's only aircraft carrier, the Admiral Kuznetsov. Because, of course, nothing bad can possibly happen by sending the only people in your Navy with organisational memory of operating an aircraft carrier to go charge a tree line. Western sources noted that this might suggest the future operational status of the Kuznetsov was now very much in question, and even some pro-Russian sources struggled with the news. One suggested, for example, that with Russia having made considerable investments in refurbishing the carrier, placing its future at risk in order to gain another naval infantry unit would be a highly unusual decision. So they suggested the battalion being formed wasn't because Russia was desperate for additional infantry and choosing to deprioritise the old carrier, but instead because the carrier was now so good after its upgrades that additional automation allowed a reduction in crew size, and it was just surplus crew that were being sent to Ukraine. Long story short, the Russians have employed just about every method other than further mobilisation to meet the needs of a very casualty-heavy war, both in terms of finding additional replacements for casualties and, over time, reorganising their force into one that is better designed to take casualties. By RUSI's assessments, at the start of 2023, there were about 360,000 Russian troops in Ukraine. By June 2023, that had increased to 410,000, and in 2024, 470,000. By July, Ukraine's General Syrskyi was estimating the Russians had lifted their force in Ukraine to 520,000 strong, with an aim of raising it even further by 2025. While those numbers are still smaller than most of the estimates we have for the Ukrainian armed forces, it's not really an apples-to-apples comparison. A huge number of jobs in any military aren't going to be frontline roles. There are going to be people doing administration, running the training grounds, serving logistics functions. And while all of those troops are going to be included in any count of the overall Ukrainian armed forces, for Russia, a lot of those personnel don't have to go to Ukraine in order to continue doing their roles supporting the invasion of Ukraine. Meaning it's very possible for the Russians to outnumber the Ukrainians at the front line, despite having a smaller force in Ukraine than the Ukrainians do. Recent estimates have tended to put Russian loss rates and replacement rates at roughly equivalent levels, meaning that while maintaining constant offensive pressure has been deeply costly for the Russian military and especially its infantry units. So far, at least, we've mostly seen the Russian army evolve into the kind of force that can regenerate through those manpower losses. One question going into 2025 then might be, what are the most likely resource pinch points for the overall Russian war effort? As we just noted, the force has likely taken hundreds of thousands of casualties, but also adopted structures and approaches to help it deal with that loss rate. For now, recruitment rates appear to remain high, while mobilisation obviously remains as an option. Similarly, the economic and financial costs of the war are clearly mounting, and despite interest rates being at 21%, the ruble recently dropped below a symbolic threshold, where it is now worth less than 1 US cent. But as we've discussed in the past, there's a huge difference between burning away a country's economic future and collapsing a war economy in the short term. So if Russia for the moment is capable of meeting its financial and manpower needs, that turns our attention to equipment. If the Russian government is ever desperate for more cash or more people in uniform, it has coercive mechanisms to get them. You can conscript troops out of the general population, shake down businesses for rubles. But civilians and businesses probably don't have massive stockpiles of military equipment and ammunition that you can just seize if you need them. And so to meet most of its requirements for the last 1,000 days, Russia has had to depend on its Soviet inheritance. And by that, I mean the fields upon fields upon fields of tens of thousands of tanks, armoured vehicles, artillery systems, and warehouses full of old ammunition that the old Soviet Union strained itself economically to produce, preparing for a war with the West that never came, only for a lot of it to end up stashed away for decades, until ultimately called upon to fight a war between two of the countries that had helped build up this massive arsenal in the first place. Now, to be clear, just how reliant Russia is on these old stockpiles varies greatly system to system. Russian war production since 2022 has featured everything from Mad Max reactivations of old Soviet equipment to pure new build stuff, to, of course, combinations of the two, like the glide bomb you can see on screen there, where a newly manufactured glide kit is added to an old Soviet free-fall bomb. There are areas where most of what's used is comparatively modern. Many of its long-range missiles, for example, are new types of new manufacture. So the size and frequency of Russia's long-range missile attacks is at this point very closely tied to how quickly Russian industry can produce them. But even then, there can sometimes be an asterisk. It is far from unusual, for example, for the Ukrainians to break open a modern Russian system and find elements or components that have been scavenged from something older. Russia can absolutely manufacture new military material, and a fair amount of it compared to many NATO countries. But it's hard to overestimate just how much of Russia's military production effort is powered by the fossil fuel that is Soviet leftovers. And so arguably a critical question here is what Russia has left in all of those old stockpiles compared to what they continue to lose on the battlefield. Because all else being equal, once those stockpiles exhaust, there really is no way for Russia to continue in the way it has. Eventually I probably will do videos that look in detail at Russian and Ukrainian equipment losses, remaining reserves, and what clues that might give us about how these forces are changing and how long they can carry on the fight. But given today is meant to be more of a high-level episode, I want to focus on just one Russian equipment category, with tanks being nominated to serve as the kind of illustrative canary in the coal mine for a couple of reasons. They tend to be visually distinct, big obvious frontline objects that are comparatively likely to be visually documented, and because I think they're a comparatively conservative category to look at when you're talking about the Russian army. For them and the Soviet army before them, tanks were an object of intense doctrinal and industrial focus. They went into this conflict with thousands of them stashed, and so saying the Russian military might be running out of tanks is kind of like saying Macca's might be running out of nuggets and fries. But, hypothetically, given enough time, a deep enough deficit will chew through any amount of savings. And while Russia's visually confirmed MBT losses fell from a colossal more than 1,500 in 2022 to a fewer than 1,000 in 2023, they picked up again significantly in 2024 and have already reached the quadruple digits. And compared to what we can visually confirm on the Ukrainian side, it does appear the Russians have continued to chew through their armour assets at a much, much higher rate, which, despite some variation as you can see on screen there, overall the magic number has consistently been at least fairly close to 4-1. To help deal with the visually confirmed loss at time of recording of nearly 3,600 main battle tanks over the course of the last 1,000 days, plus any losses that weren't visually confirmed or the result of non-combat causes, like equipment just breaking down or being lost in accidents, RUSI and some Russian sources generally point towards an estimated Russian production and reactivation rate of about 1,500 main battle tanks a year in 2023 and 2024, ramping up from a significantly lower number back in 2022. With the obvious asterisk being that Russia isn't actually building those 1,500 tanks per year. Overwhelmingly, it's reactivating, repairing, or modernising old ones. And because this is the 2020s, when it is entirely possible for people on the internet to just buy access to custom satellite imagery, Russia's various equipment storages have been very closely watched and documented by a number of people whose work I'll link in the description, but a special thanks for the figures used in this section to the like of Covert Cabal, Jompy, and HIMARST. Their work is sought not just to count the number of pieces of equipment in Russian storages, but also to classify them on quality as best as possible. By their definitions, decent equipment is something that you could probably get working, at least as far as the satellite images suggest, although it might take some serious work, while poor vehicles are those that tend to be clustered together and look like they haven't had preventative maintenance done in years, while worse quality vehicles are probably likely to be complete write-offs. Often rusted or degraded hulks that might be missing minor components like, turrets or engines. Not that that proves, of course, that those vehicles have no potential value to the Russian war effort, as some satellite imagery has shown the Russians appearing to drag vehicles even from virtual scrap piles to other sections of their bases, potentially for repair or cannibalization. But overall, at least at the time the images were taken, this is what the Russian tank storages look like. And as you can see, there's precious little blue left. All of the visible T-90s are gone. The vast majority of the visible T-80s are gone. The vast majority of the T-62s and all of the T-55s assessed as being in decent condition are gone. and none of the remaining T-64s or older T-72s are assessed as being in better than poor condition. If you want to see what this looks like proportionally by type, I'm flashing that up on screen now. At a high level, there's a fairly close match between the vehicles we've seen disappear from Russian storages and our assumptions about Russian output rates. If we assume Russia output 700 tanks in 2022, 1,500 in 2023, and is on track to do 1,500 in 2024, if the ratio between reactivations and truly new vehicles was about 85-15, that would mean 3,000 activations and around 500 new tanks. Meanwhile, we've seen 2,850 tanks disappear from storage, not counting whatever might have been hidden in garages or undercover. And if you adjust for the fact that many of these images might be 6 months old at this point and assume a constant rate of withdrawal, you'd end up adding another 280 tanks to that total for just over 3,100 all up. While the numbers aren't perfectly comparable, and you'd expect some of the vehicles pulled out of storage to still be at Russian repair bases, for example, seeing around 3,100 tanks removed is very compatible with an estimate of about 3,000 reactivated. Back in 2023, I predicted that if our numbers were roughly correct, what we would expect to see at this point is a Russian tank force that was increasingly polarised, with the share of newly built T-90 tanks holding relatively constant, while pre-war models of vehicles slowly went extinct, replaced by more Soviet-era garbage and wartime emergency models. That, as you can see on screen here, is basically what we've seen play out, with T-90Ms continuing to be a relatively small part of the Russian lost data, but never disappearing, while reactivated T-80s, T-62s or even T-55s have taken up more of the share, compared to the models that were dominant pre-invasion, like the T-72B3M. The key point here is that basically all of our data points in the direction of the following two conclusions: that Russian industry has only been able to provide the amount of equipment it has by drawing on old stockpiles, and those stockpiles are running down. Russia's situation with tanks is arguably better than it is in many other equipment categories. And of course, there are still lots of vehicles in other locations like repair bases or issued to active units. But from many thousands of tanks in Russian storage in decent condition in February 2022, these images can now only identify 579. Adjust for the age of the imagery to subtract another 280, and you're down to around 300. Those figures don't point to Russia running out of tanks or any other vital piece of military equipment in the near future, but at the same time, they suggest a crunch might be coming, with it being likely that the Russians would encounter mounting constraints in 2025 and 2026. There are, of course, a variety of potential wildcards. Russian loss rates could significantly change, or countries like North Korea could choose to provide more equipment. We've recently seen evidence, for example, of the North Koreans supplying a small number of the Koksan 170mm self-propelled guns. But in the absence of enormous transfers from the new arsenal of autocracy, so far it appears that Moscow is betting big that the war in Ukraine is probably going to end before those Soviet stockpiles do. Because, to be clear, if the trends we've seen continued, it looks like Russia would start to run out of the stuff it needs to fight the way it has, long before reaching its stated territorial goals. Meanwhile, the story of the way the Ukrainian force and its limitations have changed over the last 1,000 days is in some ways a mirror image of the Russian one. Ukraine faced off the February invasion with a shortage of organised units and equipment, but no shortage of volunteers. And indeed, some quite effective actions against the invading Russians in the opening days were disorganised local initiatives. Think blokes in civilian clothes with whatever weapons they could pull together, marching off into the nearby forest that they knew through and through to find some Russians to shoot at. Ukraine thus started to run into equipment and munition constraints long before it ran into manpower constraints. The situation reached fairly dire levels on a number of occasions, most notably after US aid got held up in the latter part of 2023, which appears to have had a significant impact on destabilising some parts of the front, which had been stable since February 2022, and also forcing the Ukrainian military to sometimes adopt tactics that were more demanding on manpower due to the shortage of firepower. That led to the current situation where no doubt the greatest challenge facing the Ukrainian military is the shortage of infantry. From a force organisation perspective, the Ukrainians have also taken a very different approach to the Russians. In terms of innovations, Ukraine decided early this year to create the Unmanned Systems Forces as their own branch, basically elevating drones and the drone forces alongside the likes of the Air Force and the Army. Then, in terms of how the Army's forces have remained organised, compared to the Russians, it's remained much more brigade-centric. And rather than, for example, establishing divisions and bolting multiple brigades together, in Ukraine the approach has often been to bulk out brigades with additional battalions, although it's common for the different parts of a brigade to be broken up and not all fight together. There are, of course, reasons the Ukrainians may have chosen to do it that way, but some external observers, like Rusi for example, have noted that the Ukrainian force structure often massively overtaxes the command and control capabilities of those brigades. You don't have the kind of headquarters staff and supporting assets, like combat engineers, for example, that you might have with a divisional structure. And so often Ukrainian brigades are pretty heavily gated by the resources they have and their capacity to control them. They also, as you might expect, tend to run into difficulties maintaining manning levels and also rotating from the front, with some Ukrainian troops having been engaged in a relatively high tempo of operations pretty continuously since February 2022. A significant question for Ukraine there in the latter part of this year and the first part of 2025 might be how it continues to evolve its organisational structure and address that manpower issue. Zelensky has said, for example, that the country is trying to form 14 new brigades so that existing brigades can be rotated off the front line and given desperately needed rest. But that requires additional equipment supplied from Western allies, and of course means that a lot of the new recruits being brought into the force have to be redirected towards those new brigades. By contrast, breaking up some of these new brigades and sending the recruits to bulk out existing units might rebuild their combat power and their ability to hold positions, and perhaps even open up options to build out the organisational structure a bit. That could also potentially have the advantage of giving new recruits veteran troops to operate alongside and learn lessons from. But it would also obviously mean generating fewer new units and thus having fewer pieces on the chessboard to be used in rotations. I think it'll be interesting to see which way the Ukrainian armed forces ultimately go as we turn into 2025. So if we're trying to determine potential pinch points for the Ukrainian force going forward, in many ways it's much harder than with the Russians. Questions like, will Ukraine have the kinds of financial resources or munitions it needs to carry on the fight until Russia reaches its own points of exhaustion, often overwhelmingly depend on the assumptions you want to make about ongoing foreign assistance. But given we talked about the potential impact of American policy on Ukraine as recently as last week, for this episode I think it's worth honing in on that currently acute manpower issue. And while there are a range of factors that go into that, like the need for potential reforms in the Ukrainian military, its mobilization systems and approach to training and unit staffing, one of the key things we probably can measure here as talk of a potential peace deal in 2025 rises is simply public opinion among that Ukrainian population that is paying the price for things like ongoing mobilization. That question is a key feature of many historical conflicts. How much is a society willing to look at a war like this one and say this is expensive, this is miserable, this is costing lots of lives, but we're going to tough it out regardless? On paper, Ukraine still has a significant mobilisation reserve. When the country brought in the new mobile application Reserve Plus earlier in 2024, according to a RUSI piece, more than 1 million reservists registered in the first days of the application's operation, and by July the number was north of 2 million. Given that the mobile app is only one of several ways that people can register, it's pretty clear that the people are there, making the more critical element whether government and society are willing to support the difficult decision to mobilise them. And there's clearly a military imperative to do so, not just to fill out units, but also to enable rotation and help rest or rotate other troops that are already in uniform. Just as with the Russians, those mobilised into the Ukrainian army at this point aren't given a definitive end date. They are in for the duration. And with some units not having properly rested or rotated, sometimes for years, as well as the introduction of many new conscripts into the force, exhaustion and morale issues are often reportedly much more common than they once were. That's probably helped feed some phenomenon like a reported increase in the number of desertion charges being filed in 2024 as compared to 2023 and 2022. One report I saw suggested there's been about 60,000 charges for desertion since the war began in Ukraine, with 9,000 in 2022, 22,000 in 2023, and a narrow majority in 2024 to date. Some estimates run even higher than that. But while mobilising more troops might be necessary in order to carry on the war, it's never going to be an easy step for society to take. Hence why gauging Ukrainian public opinion is arguably so important. In Ukraine, there's plenty of elements of public sentiment that you could measure, but I want to focus on just two key related questions. Firstly, the balance between those Ukrainians who say they believe the country should continue fighting until it wins the war over the Russian Federation, as opposed to those who think the country should focus on negotiating an end to the war more quickly, even at the cost of some concessions. And then, as a follow-up question, for those willing to negotiate a rapid end to the war, what concessions are they willing to make? Based on Gallup polling, enthusiasm in Ukraine for fighting until total victory over Russia is won has decreased over time, albeit from a very high baseline. And if you're wondering what victory over Russia or winning the war means in this context, separate polling suggests that in the overwhelming majority of cases, Ukrainians have been defining that to mean reclaiming all of their territory up to their 1991 borders, which, short of taking any of Russia itself, is about as maximalist a territorial goal as you can get in this kind of context. In 2022, those respondents favouring fighting until victory outnumbered those suggesting rapid negotiations by about 3-1. Jump forward 2 hard years of attritional fighting, and that 75% share has fallen to a bit over 40%. with the responses favouring rapid negotiations over fighting until victory, about 58 to 42. That figure and others like it have been pretty extensively reported on in recent days and weeks, and I'd argue do accurately represent the content of the polling data. However, those same Gallup polls also included another data point, also very informative, but where I think the reporting sometimes missed the mark. This was the question. Quote, do you agree or disagree that Ukraine should be open to making some territorial concessions as part of a peace deal to end the war? And the agrees outnumber the disagrees, 52 to 38. Throw that into one of our bar charts and it looks something like this, and some reports characterise this as a majority of Ukrainians now saying that they're willing to make territorial concessions. Except if you read the fine print on the previous question that I had thrown a massive orange highlight box around, you'd realise that's not actually what it says. As the note states, this question was only asked of Ukrainians who in the previous question said they were willing to negotiate and make concessions in the first place. To some extent, I understand the logic of that position from the surveyor's perspective. If someone has said they think the country should fight on to total victory, they obviously don't want to make territorial concessions. But data journalism on the internet sometimes being what it is, I might have asked it anyway, or at least decided to build some sort of composite graphic. Because what that actually says is that about half of the Ukrainians who say they want a fast negotiated peace are willing to give up some territory to do it. Rip out the non-responses for reasons I've discussed previously and compound the two questions together, and your actual opinion chart looks something like this. About 42% of Ukrainians responding that Russia can get bent, frankly, and they'll see them in Crimea. Around 30% saying that concessions might be necessary. And then this group in the middle that are happy to negotiate a rapid peace, but aren't willing to actually give Russia any territory for it. And if you use other surveys to dig a little bit deeper into the topic, arguably the gap in negotiating positions only gets wider, because the Russian government's ideas of Ukrainian territorial concessions look very different to Ukrainian ones. And as this set of questions from another survey shows, if you turn it into a binary question, where Ukrainian respondents are given access only to two of the more extreme options, either continuing to fight until the 1991 borders are achieved, or allowing the fighting to end at the current front line, the share of respondents saying they want to fight on to the end significantly increases to more than 70%. And just to demonstrate we're not cherry-picking here, let's pivot to another poll. This is another 2024 dataset that put to Ukrainians 3 hypothetical peace deals. Option 1 was that Russia gets to keep everything it currently occupies, and Ukraine agrees not to join NATO, but the country does get to join the European Union and receives all necessary financing for its reconstruction. An absolute majority of Ukrainian respondents said that kind of deal was completely unacceptable. Only 8% said it was a no-brainer, and 30% said it would be a very, very hard but acceptable compromise. Package 2 had Russia maintain occupation of the territories it currently controls without Ukraine or other countries recognising that occupation, basically freezing the conflict in place. It also had Ukraine becoming a member of NATO with real security guarantees, joining the European Union, and receiving all necessary finance for its reconstruction. Only 10% of Ukrainians said that was a no-brainer for a peace deal, and 37% a hard but acceptable compromise. That was enough to narrowly outnumber those respondents saying that kind of deal would be completely unacceptable, but not to account for a majority of all respondents. Finally, in option number 3, Ukraine actually gets Zaporizhzhia and Kherson back, doesn't recognise Russian occupation of Crimea, Donetsk and Luhansk, but allows it to continue happening for the time being, and the country becomes a member of the European Union, becomes a member of NATO, receives security guarantees and reconstruction funding. This was the only hypothetical peace deal to secure actual majority support among respondents, 20% saying it was a no-brainer, and 37% saying that would be a difficult but acceptable compromise. And a third of respondents looked at that option, where Ukraine gets just about everything it could want, except for the Donbass and Crimea, and still said no deal, presumably while suggesting that Vladimir Putin spend more time hanging around windows. And here's the thing, that package number 1, rejected by an absolute majority of Ukrainian respondents and only enthusiastically embraced by a mighty 8%, is still completely incompatible with Russia's stated war goals. In summary, going off all the polling data I've seen, even when you have a majority of Ukrainians saying they favour a negotiated peace, we have never seen anything close to a majority in favour of accepting the kind of terms that Russia is actually putting on the table. And so I'd argue we have a phenomenon that anyone familiar with polling or politics is probably acutely aware of. People saying they favour options that arguably don't exist. Last episode, I discussed Senator Marco Rubio, Trump's nominee for Secretary of State, and some of his previous comments on the war in Ukraine, where he said what he wanted to see was a peace deal which was favourable to Ukraine and prevented them becoming a Russian puppet state or eternally held hostage by Moscow, which is very much not the kind of peace deal that Russia would currently be offering. But at the same time, he was voting against military assistance to Ukraine that might coerce Moscow into changing that position. I've sometimes heard this kind of thing referred to as a cakeist position, where one wants to have their cake and eat it too. People in a poll might say they want more government services, no spending cuts, but also reduced taxes and lower deficits. Or in cases like this one, that they want a particular kind of peace deal, but aren't willing to apply either coercion or concessions necessary to secure it. And as an aside, before you fall into the trap of thinking this might be a particularly modern phenomenon, think again. I could tell you, for example, that this chart showed the opinions of members of the American public on a certain European conflict. As you can see here, 75% of Americans in this dataset are saying they believe Ukraine should meet with the Russians and negotiate a peace deal. But fewer than 40% said Ukraine should be willing to give up Crimea in order to get that peace, and only about 30% that they should also be willing to throw in Donetsk and Luhansk. At the moment, unless something puts enough heat on Moscow to force them to change their negotiating position, officially a peace deal without those kind of concessions is probably a non-starter. Thankfully, however, this isn't actually 2024 polling data. It's 1940 polling data. And it actually shows that 75% of Americans thought that France and the United Kingdom should meet with Adolf Hitler in order to work out a peace deal, but that only 37% were willing to give Hitler Czechoslovakia in exchange for that peace, and 31% were willing to give him Poland. And given the way the world looked, the military balance, and of course who the German leadership were in 1940, suggesting that just acknowledging the German annexation of Czechoslovakia might have been enough to secure peace, wouldn't just have been a stretch, it would have been a hop, skip, jump and short plane ride beyond the boundaries of the credible. There are arguably shades of this kind of effect in some of the polling data we've seen come out of Russia as well. As you can see on screen there, respondents have consistently been asked the following question. In your opinion, should Russia continue its military operation on the territory of Ukraine or move to peace talks? In early 2022, the split was 54% in favour of continue and 35% saying negotiate. Jump forward to the most recent results, and it's now 52-36 in the other direction. If you want to see what it looks like without the non-responses and I don't knows, you can see that on screen now. Just as in Ukraine, a steady shift towards the pro-negotiation camp. But if you look at other polling asking Russians whether they think the country should give up some of its territorial claims in order to secure a peace in Ukraine, perhaps unsurprisingly, the plurality answer is usually no. Yes, Russian respondents might say they would prefer the government to focus spending on society and the economy rather than the war effort, but meaningful concessions don't tend to get an enthusiastic thumbs up. And so, at least for the moment, Putin probably has plenty of scope to carry on with the invasion. The reason why I'm focusing so much on all this, in the context of where the war stands 1,000 days in and where it might be likely to go from here, is because public opinion in Ukraine is absolutely central to everything from mobilisation to taxes to the demands of the wartime budget, and because it's absolutely not enough to have everyone agree that there should be a negotiated settlement if they completely disagree on what that negotiated settlement should be. The Ukrainian constitution, which notably provides that you cannot have elections during wartime, also provides the government cannot give up Ukrainian territory. The only legal way that could potentially happen would be with a referendum. And specifically, not a local referendum, quote-unquote, of the likes the Russians claim to have organised in places like Crimea, but instead one involving all Ukrainians, with Article 73 providing that alterations to the territory of Ukraine can happen, quote, exclusively by an all-Ukrainian referendum, end quote. So it could never just be enough for allies to pressure the Ukrainian government into giving up territory to Russia. They'd have to convince a majority of Ukrainians as well. And unless the polling shifts fairly dramatically, there still seems to be a titanic gap between what Vladimir Putin is demanding and what the Ukrainian public is actually willing to give him, besides additional gunfire. These kind of polling figures obviously don't guarantee that Ukraine will be able to resolve its mobilisation, manning and organisational issues. But in a sense, it also suggests the government can't afford not to. The majority expectation among a population that at this point has had more than 1,000 days to see exactly what a war can cost still appears to be that the fight should continue regardless, in pursuit of much better terms than Kyiv is currently being offered. So where does that leave us, more than 1,000 days in, trying to address the balance of this war? In the media, we've often seen the war in Ukraine described as a stalemate, and given the relatively slow pace of territorial changes in 2023 and 2024, in a sense that might be understandable. But I'd argue the data suggests that behind that almost World War I style grind that we might see on the surface, this war is neither stable nor sustainable. Technology and tactics have rapidly evolved, and neither side has the resources they need to keep this up forever. With an important question always being, which side is likely to hit a critical shortage of something vital first? From Russia, we can see multiple signs of strain, from the economy to the increasing bonuses that need to be paid in order to drive recruitment levels, to the steady consumption of those Soviet stockpiles that have been absolutely essential to the Russian way of war. There, Russia already appears to have picked all the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, and it's likely things will get more and more difficult in 2025 and 2026 as supplies run down and increasingly dilapidated vehicles have to be sent for reactivation. Ukraine is also facing multiple pinch points, and in some cases, probably more acutely than the Russians. The available financial resources necessary to carry on the war through 2025 are probably there, and in the short term at least, Ukraine is likely to actually receive a surge in support when it comes to Western military equipment. But in the medium term, deliveries of vitally needed military assistance from Europe and the United States continue to be a question mark, while manning levels in many frontline units is reportedly already a critical concern, one that will likely need to be addressed if Ukraine aims to truly stabilise the frontline. The problem with doing any straight-line prediction, of course, is that things can obviously change. In 2022, it looked like Russia was going to run out of troops first until they enacted a range of measures to get more. Earlier this year, it looked like Ukraine was going to run down on munitions first, until new aid announcements, expanded domestic production and purchases on the international market helped alleviate those shortages. As it stands more than 1,000 days in, Russia probably retains the manpower and material advantage, as it has through much of the conflict. If nothing changes, it may be in the better position to go the distance. But whether the Russian military is actually able to break their Ukrainian opponents before breaking themselves down in the process likely depends on a range of decisions still in the time will tell column, including Allied responses to Ukraine's munition and financial requirements, and Ukraine's responses to Ukraine's manpower requirements. In the short term, both sides arguably have a clear incentive to set the best possible conditions ahead of the 20th of January. But in the medium term, things still look much more uncertain. Populations, armies and economies are clearly tired. The battlefield is arguably more drone-saturated and hostile than ever before, and neither side has everything they need to carry this on forever. But at the same time, even though both sides are tired and bloodied, neither have broken. And with there still being a titanic gulf between the negotiating positions of the two sides, it seems much more likely than not that even though we've already seen 1,000 days of fighting, there are still many more to come. And I'll coda this with a brief channel update, as this episode was, I believe, on the longer side. The main thing to say is that when I started covering this war in early 2022 and predicted that it might be a long one, I was desperately hoping I'd be wrong. My underlying concern at the time, though, was that the harsh arithmetic of a war like this is that they can often continue to the point of national exhaustion, and it can take a lot of pain and time to exhaust a country like Russia or Ukraine supported by various allies. And now in late 2024, even though we can see several of those exhaustion points very visibly getting closer, I still think the math suggests, unfortunately, that we might still have some way to go. In terms of broader channel updates, I'll keep them brief. Patrons, there should be a post going up within an hour or two of this episode going live, so keep an eye out for that one. And beyond that, I'll just extend my thanks to all of you for your ongoing support and engagement, and I hope to see you all again next week.